We're edging towards World War, and over the past few hours, some major news on that front. We now have confirmation that the United States of America has been lying to us about U.S. forces in Ukraine. We have the U.S. stockpiling drugs to fight radiation sickness in case of a nuclear fallout. Or nuclear explosions. So they're buying up all of the radiation drugs. Russia launched a massive military operation. And we knew that this was going to come sooner or later, right? That the military was going to launch a devastating attack on Ukrainian forces. And they did just that. We have a small update, at least, on some of the major military operations, which is a major attack on Kherson. The Russian military attacked in all directions. It pushed the armed forces of Ukraine from the line of defense. This was reported by the journalists and to the Ministry of Defense. According to the agency, the Russian military managed to destroy more than 100 Ukrainian servicemen, as well as 6 tanks, 8 armored combat vehicles, and 9 vehicles. The ministry also reported on strikes on the points of temporary deployment of the 35th Marine Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in the Kherson region. In addition, so this is the big piece I wanted to point out, is now the aerospace forces of Russia pounding targets in a way that we haven't seen before. So the Russian aerospace forces dealt high precision blows to the points of deployment of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Nikolaev area. Also, Der Spiegel, which is up there on your screen, that's a German newspaper. Ukraine's forces are being devastated, and these little offensive movements are being met with crushing defeats. That's why today, according to Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, the European Union is set to train 15,000 new Ukrainian soldiers. The European Union, according to Der Spiegel, is training 15,000 new Ukrainian soldiers. Well, a lot of it was happening in Germany. It was happening in Stuttgart, actually. We also know at Ramstein Air Force Base. So a lot of the training was happening there. It was also happening in Kent, in the UK, and there was also training in Denmark. Mm-hmm. So there's been training in multiple locations throughout the European Union. I think the big news, there's a whole bunch of big news today, but this major piece that happened just shortly before we came on the air is what Vladimir Zelensky just issued a statement, basically saying NATO needs to strike preemptively now inside of Russia. I mean, now the cat's out of the bag. It's not us. NATO needs to attack Russia inside Russia. And oh, by the way, yes, go ahead and use nuclear weapons. This is Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Watch.
Що повинна робити НАТО? Унеможливлювати застосування Росією ядерної зброї. Але, що важливо, я ще раз звертаюсь до міжнародної спільноти. Як це було до 24-го? Превентивні удари, щоб вони знали, що з ними буде, якщо вони застосують, а не навпаки. Чекати ядерних ударів Росії, щоб потім сказати, ах ти так, ну ось тримай від нас. Переглянути застосування свого тиску. Ось я вважаю, що повинна робити НАТО. Переглянути порядок застосування.
But here's another take on this, which is this news piece. NATO must make it impossible for Russia to use nuclear weapons, according to Zelensky. President Zelensky believes that NATO should make it impossible for Russia to use nuclear weapons. Preemptive strikes are needed so that they know what awaits them if they use nuclear weapons. So preemptive strikes are needed. So we need to attack inside Russia using NATO forces. The Kremlin responded a short time ago. Vladimir Putin's spokesman slamming Ukrainian president, demanding for preventative strikes on Russia. The Kremlin has accused Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky of trying to spark a third world war after he demanded that NATO carry out preemptive strikes on Russia to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Zelensky stated that NATO must ensure Moscow does not use nukes against Kyiv forces. To do this, he called the U.S.-led military bloc and international community carried out preemptive strikes against Russia so that it knows what to expect. The Biden administration thinks that nuclear war is coming in the United States. They just bought up all of the anti-radiation drugs for use in a nuclear emergency. This is from the Health and Human Services. They just printed this on their website. The Health and Human Services purchases drugs for use in radiological and nuclear emergencies. They bought up like 300 million rounds of it. So yay, great. Now we've got that. So as part of a long-standing ongoing effort to better be prepared to save lives following radiological and nuclear emergencies, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is purchasing a supply of the drug Nplat from Amgen. That being said, we have a bombshell new report out today from The Intercept detailing how the United States has been using extensive deployment of U.S. troops inside Ukraine, and they are conducting unknown operations. This is unbelievable. So let's read from the Intercept report here. Halfway through the article, they drop the bombshell that secret U.S. operations inside Ukraine are being conducted under a presidential covert action finding. Yet, clandestine American operations inside Ukraine are now far more extensive than they were early in the war, when U.S. intelligence officials were fearful that Russia would steamroll over the Ukrainian army. There is a much larger presence of both CIA and U.S. special operations personnel resources in Ukraine than were at that time of the Russian invasion in February. Several current and former intelligence officials told The Intercept. It goes deeper than that. Secret U.S. operations inside Ukraine are being conducted under a presidential covert action finding, current and former officials said. Deeply troubling. Let's ask the president. Mr. President, as reporters attempted to do today in some part, Mr. President, do you have anything to say for yourself? You've been lying to us the whole time. So what is a presidential covert action finding? This is the technicality that he's authorized the use of U.S. military forces in Ukraine. So Michael Tracy explains this in a tweet this afternoon. He says, I wonder if we'll ever get to see a copy of Biden's presidential covert action finding authorizing secret U.S. military operations in Ukraine, or if there's another John Poindexter running around who's determined to make sure we never get to see it. Of course, what he's referring to there is John Poindexter, who worked was the national security advisor to Ronald Reagan, who ripped it up when it was being used for the Iran-Contra, to Reagan's justification for sending arms to the Iranians in the Iran-Contra scandal. We invited excellent independent journalist Michael Tracy on the show to unpack this a little further. What was your response upon seeing this report?
Well, since the moment the war started, I've seen speculation to this effect that there was just assumed to be a presence of American special forces or American personnel of some kind that were on the ground in Ukraine. Now, we did know that there had been a public deployment of actually the Florida National Guard in Ukraine prior to the war. That was a long-term deployment for, quote unquote, training purposes. And what was claimed in February is that that unit or units of the Florida National Guard that had been deployed to Ukraine for training had been withdrawn in anticipation of the Russian invasion, because the idea was the U.S. did not want its forces to be in direct combat with Russia. Certainly, Joe Biden repeatedly pledged really, that he would not deploy American forces to take part in direct combat against Russia, hence that withdrawal of the National Guard unit. But even aside from that, the internet was flush with speculation that, just kind of assume in these sorts of situations that there would probably be some sort of covert or, stealth American military presence. Now, I had been looking for months to see if I could get any kind of hard verification of it, hard reporting of it. In April, there was a hard report in the Times, the newspaper in the UK, that a British Special Forces deployment was physically in Ukraine as of April. Now, what do you infer from that? Well, most of the time, the UK military does what it does in tandem with the US military. It really operates as a subsidiary much of the time of the US military. So you might expect that if there was this on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground presence of the UK military, something might be happening likewise with the US, but there was no hard verification of that really as far as I could tell. You kind of just have to maybe surmise things or infer things. But then yesterday, for the first time that I'm aware of, The Intercept did report, and it's strange because they didn't actually emphasize this in the headline.
Right.
You'd think they would. They kind of buried it because they were emphasizing other aspects of the sort of intelligence that they had been made privy to on the, what the U.S. anticipated as to the efficacy of the Russian invasion. I would have personally probably emphasized this part, which is that there have been continuously since the onset of the war a special forces deployment inside physically to Ukraine. Now, they don't specify what those special forces have been doing. They don't say whether they've been engaged in combat or not. They don't say really anything at all about what they've been up to. But what would they be up to in a war zone? I don't know. You tell me. I mean, it's ridiculous that it took, 7-8 months for this information to come out in plain text when it was the case all along.
Let's talk about this presidential covert action finding. If anybody watching right now who's not a student of history might not be aware of what this phrase means and how it's been used in history, I was surprised to read this in this report also, that this is how President Biden was using this in order to justify putting boots on the ground inside Ukraine, the presidential covert action finding. What is this? How has it been used before? And what power does it give the presidency?
Well, it's a pretty obscure mechanism, as you might expect for a mechanism that's intended to be kept secret, to authorize secret operations.
Right.
I mean, this is a very obscure order, again, for a reason. That there's one of the most famous instances of an order like this being issued was by Ronald Reagan in December of 1985, when he issued one of these, findings to authorize the, what was then the technically illegal shipment of arms to Iran, right, as part of what came to be later known as the Iran-Contra affair. And the document that Reagan signed authorizing this secretly was then later destroyed by his national security advisor, John Poindexter, who then got prosecuted criminally for that. There is an emerging consensus among, fairly reputable analysts, media outlets, even very hawkish media outlets, like, the Dispatch. They're all putting out articles and proclamations saying that the risk that the U.S. the U.S. and the world now faces from nuclear destruction is as high as it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. So we have that. And on top of that, we now have the first confirmation that there are boots on the ground in Ukraine. And the U.S. is not just operationally coordinating and subsidizing the war effort against the world's largest nuclear armed power. They're engaging in physical execution of it in the war zone itself, which had never been, at least to my knowledge, acknowledged so openly until this article came out yesterday. So that's a hugely combustible combination of events that you'd think would merit some, front page, so to say, right, coverage or commentary. Even just earlier this year, when suddenly this major Russian warship gets sunk, mm-hmm, right, and everybody's saying, rah, rah, look at the ingenuity of the Ukrainians. They're doing such an amazing job. We underestimated their tenacity. It's such a wonderful, inspiring story of, what a military force can do under the, most dire of conditions. And then, the New York Times then eventually afterwards lets us all know that, oh, by the way, it was actually operationally coordinated by the U.S., the sinking of this Russian flagship.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that's the pattern. We don't get told anything of significance usually in real time, and we all just have to kind of read tea leaves until the New York Times can be bothered to tell us about the secrets whispered to them that are probably incomplete themselves from different intelligence. When the war started, I went to the border in Poland, and I went to physically the new military installation that the U.S. had constructed in Yeshiv at this airport facility, where they were. This was the U.S. This is from where the U.S. was organizing the deployment of huge amounts of armament into a war zone, and it was all shut off from any kind of media scrutiny. I mean, you can't, to this day, to my knowledge, you can't, no journalist has actually examined any of this new military infrastructure that's been constructed. Now, I tried to, catch glimpses of stuff here and there, or see trucks going in and out, or, things being handed off. But it's a massive operation. I mean, and in fact, the U.S., they just announced this at the NATO conference in June, which I also went to in Madrid, that the U.S. is going to be making a base permanent in Poland now.
Right.
And so the idea that this is that was the end of it, or like where our knowledge of what is involved in this massive scale military operation was complete was also always just preposterous. And yet, that's not how the situation tends to be portrayed in the media. The media have this sort of like euphoric, joy around, supporting Ukraine or screaming Slava Ukraini or whatever. And that's basically the extent of their, dispassionate analysis of the situation. What's the commonly understood to be the precipitating event of the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was Soviets wanting to bring Russia nuclear warheads into Cuba, right? Right near the United States landmass.
Right.
Well, Poland's pretty close to Ukraine. It's on the border, actually.
This is the stage we're in right now. This is the elevation of tensions. I mean, we've got the United States actively, multiple reports now with U.S. forces actively there, and not just a small contingent, but actively in charge of the heavy weapons. This is, of course, as we had David Petraeus here, a total lie on the part of David Petraeus, telling us that, no, there's no active boots on the ground by the United States in Ukraine. Nothing at all. Nothing to see here.
Yeah. It's really shocking, and it feels just like massive escalation right as we speak, but it's not. It has been all along.
Yeah.